So in addition to the other videos that are available to you in Module 5, I've created this presentation that is a brief 20 minutes explanation of model performance indicators with some explanations and examples so that you can see how to put this type of lesson or an assessment objective together for your final design project. So with the implementation of Common Core state standards, differentiation is a term that for various seemingly misguided reasons has fallen out of favor. And we really need to revisit and reincorporate the idea of differentiation for language so that we can continue to improve our ability to support our ELLs. So what is differentiation? It's scaffolds and supports for supporting our students in engaging in the lesson content at their language proficiency levels. It can be applied to both assessment and instruction, and should be. And it can be applied in many different ways. It can be applied to the material, the input, can be applied to the products, the processes, or the environment of the learning or assessment procedure. And it considers the student's proficiency level in each domain. So we want to be very focused on what mode of communication the student is using in order to demonstrate his learning or engage in learning. And this can determine the type of differentiation that we'll use. And most importantly, the differentiation that we're focusing on for our ELLs is differentiation in terms of language development more than content, academic content. So how are we going to incorporate this differentiation? WIDA has developed a way to embed this right into our instructional objectives, and they're called model performance indicators, or MPIs, and that's the term that I'm going to use for the rest of this module, MPI. It's another type of I can statement. And all of the information about WIDA MPIs can be found in the resource page here at Module 5. You want to download the WIDA MPI packet and take a look at that. So model performance indicators are examples of how language can be processed or produced by students within a particular instruction or assessment context. Now, the thing to remember about MPIs is that they're not fixed, they're not static like Common Core academic standards. They are situational. They take into consideration the particular content topics through which you plan to teach your standards, as well as the particular language needs of your students. And so, as I said, they're highly situational and dependent on the teaching context. And so they're going to change from one context to another, from one student group to another. So these are the building blocks of a model performance indicator. They have three key components. So the first is the language function, which it considers what language the students will process or produce in order to show their learning. And these come from the WIDA can-do descriptors. The second component is the content STEM, the academic topic, concept, or skill that you are addressing in your instructional unit. And what authentic text will the students engage with? These parts of the objective come from the Common Core State Standards, or STEM. And then the third component is the support strategy. What scaffolding are you going to use to support your students at their language level so that they can engage with the content? Once again, I want to mention the WIDA Essential Actions MPI packet. This is a rather large PDF file that's found in the resource page in Module 5. I'd like for you to download it and have it available to you to refer to. It's broken up into four areas actually. An area about the language functions, an area about the differentiated supports, an area about how to put all these things together to create a model performance indicator, and then the last section is several tables and charts that you can use as resources. So as you learn how to develop model performance indicators for your unit of instruction and your assessments, I want you to think, how can you apply this to your unit of instruction, and how could this approach specifically allow your students, for example, your case study student, to demonstrate his or her learning. So as you already know from the can-do statements, your students are at different levels of language proficiency, and these levels are defined by certain performance definitions that include key features of academic language. These are linguistic complexity, language forms and conventions, and vocabulary usage. And so to make this more simple, vocabulary usage, we just say this is the word level. So we're talking about words. What words do our students have available to them? Language forms, this is about grammar. This is making good sentences with correct grammatical structures. And then the third level, linguistic complexity, is the discourse level, the amount of speech or text that's either processed or produced, with the variety, and how does it cohere in logical ways. So these are all key considerations when students are when you're determining how your students are going to communicate their mastery of a skill or content area. So the language function is the first component. The second component is the content, the academic content STEM, and then the third component is what type of support are you going to incorporate into that objective to help that student engage with the academic content at the language level that you want him to use. So this is a table that is also in your MPI packet, one of many tables, and you've seen this before from Module 4, the different types of supports that you might consider using depending on the language goal and the content, the academic objective. So what does a model performance indicator look like? Again, an MPI is just another term for an I can statement, a unit objective, an assessment objective. The Common Core state standards are objectives, but they are not transparent enough for our ELLs in terms of what language function, what's the focus of the language that we're going to ask them to use to show their learning. This is really useful for us to really focus how we assess and how we teach our ELLs. So as you can see, we have the three components here: the language function, the content STEM, and the support. Okay, so the language processes used in receiving or conveying a message. An example of a language function would be to describe. Okay, and in your packet, in your packet, and also in the research page, and in your assignments, there are downloadable files with lists of the different types of language functions that you might use in an academic learning setting. The second component is the content STEM. These would be familiar to you from your Common Core standards. This example would be from a math component of the Common Core, linear equations and graphs, okay, having to do with rates of speed, okay. And then the third component, the support. How is the student going to show what he knows about this math concept using the language function of describing? What support does he need to do that? And our example here gives him a word bank and sentence frames. Okay, so this is one example of an MPI. And here's an example of a chart similar to one that you will fill out for one of your assignments that lists model performance indicators for one content standard. Okay, and in this case, this is the English Language Development Standard of Social and Instructional Language. Okay, and the topic is resources and supplies at school. So if you take a look at the different performance levels, you can see the language functions change depending on what that student is known to be able to do. So if you take a look at level 5, which is near native proficiency level, that student is going to be asked to evaluate and select needed resources for tasks or projects based on oral discourse. So they're going to listen to some input and then make some decisions about what school resources they're going to need to complete a certain task. If you look at level 2, it's the same content goal, but using different modes and processes of language. And these modes and processes are more in line with his level 2 language proficiency. So instead of creating some type of constructed response, he's going to do a select response of matching resources and supplies using pictures and simpler oral statements, okay, to determine what resources are the best resources for certain types of activities. So you can see we have this is the language function for level 2. This is matching. Now, matching you might not think is a language function, but what it is a processing of language input. Okay, whereas most of these other, this is actually a listening activity. So all of these are processing language input: identify, match, categorize, analyze, and evaluate. Okay, so these look a little bit like terms from Bloom's taxonomy, cognitive functions, and they sometimes can be overlapping. So that is something to consider, but you need to look to see what the student is being asked to do through the communication process, whether it's input or production. And to examine the differentiated supports for this task, you can see that level 5, there is no visual support, so to speak. There is just oral discourse, and the student is going to simply explain what resources he might need. As you look at the lower levels, you can see that one of the supports is pictures. Okay, they all have pictures. All right, so this would be an example of a differentiated support. So let's take a closer look at a set of model performance indicators. And the cognitive function that's going to be expected for this academic task is to analyze. But what's the language function that the student will need to engage in order to show how well he is analyzing? So for level 5 and level 6, they would be comparing and contrasting. Comparing and contrasting. In level 3, it's being changed to categorizing, okay? And in level 2 and level 1, it's identify. So these are more in line with the language functions that these students are able to do. And as you can see, each one of these has the same academic content. So they're all being asked to do the same thing academically, but with different language functions. So the academic content is narrative points of view. You can see all 5 of these have that academic content stem. Okay. And then you can see that the differentiated supports are also changed according to the language levels. Okay, so level 5, they're going to actually engage with extended text. That's, not a whole lot of differentiated support there, not needed. Okay, but then you've got level 4, extended text, but using graphic organizers and with a partner. So that's 2 supports. Okay, level 3, perhaps not extended text any longer, but illustrated text, and then using word and phrase banks with a partner. So you can see how all of these have been differentiated to support that student to show what they can do with the language that they have available to them. So here's another example of a model performance indicator. This comes from 2nd grade math content, where the students are asked to navigate through story word problems. Okay, so the MPI here is identify. Okay, this is the language function. The academic content stem is required operations of a word problem, and then the differentiated support is the word wall. And here's the photograph of the word wall. So students were looking at story problems to determine whether the required operation was subtraction or addition, and they used these word walls to analyze the text and see what they could find to make meaning, to determine and make that inference and identify the appropriate operation. Here's another example of an MPI adapted from 2nd grade ELA content Common Core Standard. The language function, as you can see, is retell a story. Okay, and the ELA content stem is cause and effect. Okay, the supports, there are 2 in this sentence. The students worked in partners and they used word sorts or sentence sorts. And here you can see the visual, how they worked together to retell the story of Alexander and the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, showing which sentences were the cause and which sentences were the effect, and how to put the connecting word correctly between the 2 parts to show a logical cause and effect sentence structure. Again, another example, you've got the language function in red, make an argument, the academic content stem, health benefits, and then the differentiated support, graphic organizers. This is all put together into one logical I can statement. And many teachers will put these MPIs, these I can statements, up on a board with their student work to show the connection of the objective to the work. So it's a good idea to share your approach to differentiation with your school community so that they can see how your approach works. So as I said before, there are some quick learning activities in this module, but then there are 2 key assignments that you'll need to complete. One is creating your model performance indicators with the 3 key components: the language function, the content, and the support strategy. The other assignment that you'll need to do is to create your language inventory. So what you'll need to do is really take a close look at your unit of instruction and determine what language functions are typically used to communicate that content. So here is a guide that is in your assignments and also in your MPI packet. This is like a little cheat sheet. You ask yourself these key questions to determine how you're going to create your MPIs, okay? So you need to know your content standards, your Common Core content standards, and the concepts and skills that are going to be part of your unit of instruction. You need to make an analysis of the language use. So what types of language functions are your students going to need to engage in order to navigate the content, okay? And then you're going to ask these questions so that you can compose your model performance indicators, right? What language are the students going to use and at what level of proficiency, okay? What level of proficiency are your students at, okay? And then what instructional supports will be the most efficient for your students to use to access the content. So again, here is an example of a completed MPI chart. This is a grade 3 Common Core content for language arts. The standard for writing, okay, with guidance and support from peers and adults, develop and strengthen writing as needed by planning, revising, and editing, okay? So the language use, students will provide feedback to peers in writing conferences to recognize key elements in strengthening narratives, okay? So they're actually going to do some writing analysis. What's the cognitive function? They're going to evaluate. How are they going to use language to evaluate? And you have different MPIs for different language levels, okay? So at the higher level, they're actually going to provide constructed responses, detailed feedback, okay? Level 4 would be more to suggest ideas, perhaps not in as much extended discourse, using word banks as the differentiated support. So the language function is suggest, right? Here, compose sentences about revising from models, that's level 3. Here, compose phrases and simple sentences about revising from models. And for level 1, supply words for sentences. So they're going to have sentence starters about revising models. They are all navigating and engaging with the same academic content, but using different levels and supports of language. Also, for this unit, grade 3, here is an example of a language features inventory. This is the second assignment that you need to complete. And you can see the examples of linguistic complexity for levels 1 to 3, examples of linguistic complexity for levels 2 to 4, and then levels 3 to 5. Okay, so what are you going to expect in terms of language use at the discourse level, the sentence level, and the word level for your different level students? So to wrap up, these are the key things that you need to know and be able to do in order to create your model performance indicators, which are going to be your objectives for your assessment design project. Know and understand who your students are. For your assessment, you will only need to create MPIs for the students that are going to be taking this test. So if, for example, you have no level 3 students, it wouldn't be necessary for you to create MPIs for a level 3 group. Okay, you want to make sure that you're using all 4 language domains, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, when you create your MPIs. Okay, you want to incorporate appropriate supports. differentiate language proficiency, but maintain academic rigor of content. That's the key thing. And then finally, you want to give constructive feedback to your students about language use so that they can so that it promotes their language development. So, in conclusion, differentiated instruction is an effective way to give all students a chance to learn and show growth in a meaningful learning environment.